Good evening, everyone. I see we're a big group already. We've got just another minute or two before we get started. Thank you so much for joining us. Welcome to everybody that's still coming in. We've got just another few seconds before we'll get started. Thanks for spending your evening tonight. Jean, thanks for sharing where you're from. I always love to hear where people are from, so please feel free to add that in if you feel comfortable doing that. Tish, it's good to see your name again. Thanks for doing a double header today. So we've got some local folks from New England and Massachusetts, Rockville, Maryland, Lowell, Cumberland, Rhode Island, Keene, New Hampshire. It's great to see where everybody's coming from. Second program with me today. Thank you. Thank you. I am incredibly honored that you came back for more. And then we do have a friend in Glasgow, don't we? Thank you so much for being here tonight. I wonder how late it is in Glasgow. Um, Vineyard Haven, Lexington, Mass, North Chelmsford, Andover, Charleston, South Carolina. Larry, thanks for being here. Barbara from Chelmsford. This is such a great group. Brooklyn, New York, thanks for being here. Lincoln, Natick, Nashua, New Hampshire. Back for more from New York. Thank you. And Sudbury, Massachusetts. That's so great. And Belmore, New York. Oh, and Lita says she was just at the Rockwell Museum last week. So this will be like a little bit of a refresher, or as I like to say, like a deeper dive in. I hear from a lot of people that their experience with the programs is sort of more in depth than their experience at the museum. So I hope you get a lot out of today. Frank's back for more too. Groton, Mass. Beverly from Santa Teresa, New Mexico. That's awesome. Brenda, thanks for joining us from Manhattan. This is such a great group from all over. Wow, this is very flattering. Thank you, everybody, for being here. We're just a minute or so after the hour. So I say, let's dive right in. If you have never been to one of these programs before, if you're not one of the initiated who's on their second Jane O'Neill program for the evening, welcome. My name is Jane O'Neill, and I own the company Culturally Curious. I specialize in putting together art appreciation programs like this one and sharing them with anyone who will listen. So I'm very happy and grateful to have your time and attention tonight. I know there's lots of great things to watch on TV and in the theater, so I appreciate really having your eyeballs this evening. And I will make good use of your time tonight. Now, just a little bit about me. My background is in art history and in education. I have a master's degree in both. And some years ago, about 7 years ago, I think it was at this point, I put together this company to share some of my favorite stories from the history of art. And then it's just been a lot of fun. And now I put together a program basically every month, and the Chelmsford Public Library and Amesbury Public Library, so many of these great libraries in Massachusetts are really some of my favorite communities because they come back every month for more. So we've got this great arts loving community all coming together here via Zoom. And once again, I really appreciate everyone being here. So if you've never been to one of these before, I think this is a program that will be like your a great introduction to what I do, because Norman Rockwell and these other illustrators make it easy. They make it really fun to look at art together. And so we'll be having fun getting better acquainted with the illustrations and the illustrators from the Saturday Evening Post. So let me give you a sense in terms of how we'll spend this hour together. And we'll also take a closer look at that image that I had on the title slide. We're going to get started tonight with just a little bit of an overview in terms of background information on the Saturday Evening Post, just so we have a sense in terms of its sort of outsized influence in American culture. And then we'll turn our attention to the illustrators themselves and their incredible paintings and drawings for the Saturday Evening Post culture covers. And we'll talk about how they were a community really of very similar individuals at similar stages in their lives and careers, and how they influenced each other, and how some subjects were almost evergreen, perennial. They would go back to them all the time, and the artists would tweak an idea and then represent it in a new way. We'll see that Norman Rockwell was particularly good at doing that. And this is a Norman Rockwell image on the screen here. This is a cover from 1938, and it's called Blank Canvas. So the concept here is our cover illustrator has run out of ideas, and his canvas here is still blank. It's got the masthead for the Saturday Evening Post on it. It's got the due date lurking up here in the upper left-hand corner. And here is this artist that we see from behind who's scratching his head and can't come up with a darn idea for the cover. And of course, time is ticking away here. And if you have really good eyes, you can see down below that there is a book here labeled Bills. So the pressure is on. And it gives us a little peek into the lives and the pressure on some of these artists, right? It's so wonderful and so Norman Rockwell that he would turn his own troubles into a cover and somehow even make it relatable too. I mean, he portrays himself as like this scrawny, gangly weakling here who has all the same problems as the average American. He's got bills to pay and a deadline looming, right? Okay, so, oops, sorry about that. I just minimized that screen there. Let's go back to that. Okay, so let's dive into a little bit of a background on the Saturday Evening Post. So the Saturday Evening Post was an incredibly important early form of mass media in this country. It goes back to, it has this kind of storied history. It was founded in 1821. And what you'll see on the cover of many of the earlier editions of the Saturday Evening Post is a reference to Benjamin Franklin, or over here, a depiction of Benjamin Franklin. He was oftentimes depicted on the cover of the Saturday Evening Post. And that is because the magazine was actually first printed in the same print shop as Benjamin Franklin's Pennsylvania Gazette. There was a little bit of time in between the publication of these two magazines, but the Saturday Evening Post always claimed for itself its roots were really Benjamin Franklin and the Pennsylvania Gazette. So it's almost like the founding fathers were involved in putting this magazine together. Now, what's important to know here is that right around, well, throughout the 19th century, there were a number of publications throughout the country, but they were primarily regional publications that spoke to local interests in local voices. And the Saturday Evening Post was one of the first magazines in the country that had kind of greater aspirations beyond that. It all kind of came down to this individual that we're looking at here named George Lorimer. He was hired in 1899. He stayed on for 37 years. And he was the editor who said, we're going to make this a national publication. We're going to speak to all of America. And of course, we realize that when you do that, when you have this mode of communication that can connect with as many Americans as possible, that is hugely influential. We've got this great Norman Rockwell cover over here on the right to illustrate just that, a little newsstand that has nothing but Saturday Evening Post covers on it, which in fact replicate the cover that we're looking at, sort of the Drost effect there. So Lorimer has this outsized influence in terms of making the magazine a national brand. He also helps to introduce major writers into the United States like Jack London. So the Saturday Evening Post is publishing editorials, fiction, nonfiction, cartoons, poetry. It's all in there. It really is for the middle class. It's for a well-read populace. And of course, those covers, that cover art was designed specifically to pull you, me, the reader, in as quickly as possible. Now, there was another figure involved with doing just that. And that was an art editor who came on at the Saturday Evening Post in 1943. So just sort of in the middle of World War II. His name was Ken Stewart, and we can see him here in a photograph on the left, and he's standing in front of a Norman Rockwell painting called Saying Grace, a classic Norman Rockwell, where we can see a grandmother and a little boy in a crowded diner near a train station. You can just make out the trains in the background, where they have their luggage, and they're sharing a table with these two young men, and they are pausing to give thanks before they eat their meal, and that has made them quite the spectacle in this busy diner setting, presumably in a city here, right? So I bring in this picture because Norman Rockwell actually gave the finished oil painting to Ken Stewart as a gift. Incidentally, it was auctioned off a few years ago for $46 million. But I want to share with you the influence that Ken Stewart had at the Saturday Evening Post. He sort of broadened the horizons for a lot of these illustrators. And one of the main changes that he made was shifting from the kind of image that you see on the left over here to the kind of image that you see on the right. Again, these are both Norman Rockwell images, but you can see it in the pre-Ken Stewart design. It's a white background. The artist has to contend with how the image overlaps or underlaps with the masthead itself, making sure the masthead is legible in some ways, and then telling a story, giving us a narrative with really the bare minimum of space and information. So in this case, we understand that it's a young wife who's kind of keen on redecorating her home, especially her husband's favorite armchair, and he's glancing behind as he's realizing that things are about to change, and he looks a little dubious about that. And then post Ken Stewart, he decides to separate the masthead from the images on the cover, and he decides to encourage artists to include as much detail as possible. So now the magazine goes from just trying to grab your attention to becoming something that you can also dwell with. This is an image that can stay on your coffee table or on your dining room table for the entire week, and you're still fascinated by it because there's all of this wonderful detail. So I love the connection here. We've got this guy looking over the back of his armchair, and we've got this little girl looking over the back of her seat on the train, and she is gazing at this young soldier who is on leave with his sweetheart, and they're sort of cuddling up in a train car, seemingly unaware of the audience that they have over here. So we can see that Rockwell's using a much more daring composition in this case. If there was a white background, he probably wouldn't have been able to describe this canoodling couple at this angle. But now we get this extra detail here that might have been considered superfluous otherwise. The details of this woman's hair, this soldier's haircut, and the navy hat that he's wearing, the other details of the luggage, and even the tickets in the seat. There's so much to feast your eyes on here. It's really just a delight to spend time with. Now, as we head into the 1950s, the world is changing, the magazine business is changing, and a lot of the Saturday Evening Post competitors start using photography instead of illustrations on their covers. And let me just give you a sense in terms of what that might look like if you were in the checkout aisle at the grocery store. Life magazine has a picture of an atomic explosion, an actual photograph of that on the cover. And then the Saturday Evening Post has sort of this sweet, lighthearted scene where a mother is having her little son dress up for her in his bedroom. We can see his toys sort of tucked behind the closet door here. He's taken off his cowboy costume, and he is with great consternation trying on this outfit for his mom. Look at how our cover artist here is still describing the mother, although he's kind of cut her in half. We see her lovely legs over here and her beautiful smiling face in the reflection. So it's an endearing image, it's a playful image, it's one that again you can sort of feast your eyes on, and you can imagine that the average American probably delighted in the details of the home here because it was so relatable, right? You might have your kids might have the same toys, or you might remember a similar experience growing up. There was a lot to love about this. And so you can see why this kind of illustration still remain popular for at least the next decade or so. All right, so let's turn our attention now to these illustrators. We'll get a little bit of a sense in terms of who they were and their contributions to the Saturday Evening Post. And along the way, I'm going to bring in a lot of comparisons with Norman Rockwell because, of course, he's the artist that we know best. And so we are actually going to start not with Rockwell, but really with an artist that he considered his idol. J.C. Leyendecker was kind of Rockwell before Rockwell, and then he's kind of been lost in to a lot of people's memories because Rockwell outshined him in so many ways. But Leyendecker contributed just as many covers to the Saturday Evening Post as Rockwell did. He was prolific, over 320 covers. He also specialized in babies and children in a lot of his covers, but we'll see he approaches it in a very different way. He also had an interesting perspective on manhood. We'll take a look at that. And sadly for Leyendecker, his reputation did not continue on after his death or after his relationship with the magazine. I read recently that following his death, his original paintings were actually sold at yard sales for like $75. And $75 is what the Saturday Evening Post was paying for their cover art back in the 19 teens. So his reputation sort of fell away. I'm happy to reintroduce you. So he sort of gets his start, J.C. Leyendecker, by painting New Year's babies right around the turn of the century. And who doesn't love to look at an adorable naked baby, right? It appeals to our instincts as parents so often, and there's just something so sweet and innocent about the subject. So he gets called back in again and again each year to paint a New Year's baby, and they go from quickly being something that looks quite realistic to being stylized. And then it just gets over the top really quickly. J.C. Leyendecker's babies are all of a sudden gracing the magazine on other holidays, even Easter, sometimes on Thanksgiving. And notice that the baby gets so stylized. The baby becomes very shiny. There's an emphasis on the plumpness of the baby. The baby's oftentimes doing things that babies cannot do. So there's just this notion in the first decade or so. Well, at this point, we're already into the 1930s, that these babies sell magazines. They get attention and they're beloved, and of course, people see them and want to buy an issue of the Saturday Evening Post. Now, believe it or not, the babies remain popular almost right up through mid-century, and the babies are still prominent on the covers of the Saturday Evening Post as America goes to war. Look at these images of babies in helmets and babies with rifles. Apparently, America just could not get enough of J.C. Leyendecker's plump little babies. It didn't matter what they were engaged in. They sold magazines. And of course, these are almost cartoonish babies compared to where he started in the first few years of the 20th century. So to speak to the Saturday Evening Post's outsized influence in American culture, this J.C. Leyendecker cover from 1914 here, where we can see a floral delivery on Mother's Day, actually is the origination of the tradition of giving your mother flowers on Mother's Day. So we have J.C. Leyendecker to thank, and the Saturday Evening Post to thank for all the bouquets that are sold over Mother's Day weekend. And J.C. Leyendecker had a great sense in terms of those familial relationships and how to play them out on the cover of the Saturday Evening Post. This is presumably a Thanksgiving cover from 1914. And we see this young man coming home. He's well dressed. He's got this nice overcoat and a suit on, as well as a hat. And he's come home to his mother, who's wearing her apron. And she's overjoyed to see her son. They're embracing here, and they've kind of pulled away from each other, and she's gazing at his face as he smiles at her. It's an idealized scene. It's a sweet and charming scene. And of course, even the dog is happy to see this young man. Now, an image like this was so powerful and so influential that even decades later, Norman Rockwell is kind of playing with the exact same concept. This was a Christmas cover now, and he sort of rotated this embrace so that we see the young man from behind. We see the overcoat, we see the suit, but we don't see his face. And because Rockwell gives us this homecoming from behind, we get to project ourselves into the body of this young man who's returned home. We get to be the person who sees all of these smiling faces as he comes through the door. And we all get to feel as Americans the happiness of this time of year, right? And Rockwell included himself and his own family in his particular portrayal of this homecoming. So we can see Rockwell here with his pipe. This is his wife, this is his son, and his two other sons are also included, as well as other family friends and other illustrators from the Saturday Evening Post here. So we can see in this case, J.C. Leyendecker has sort of come up with a concept, and Rockwell kind of dusts it off, he polishes it up, and he represents it to America in a way that is just so pleasing, right? Now, I mentioned Leyendecker also had a real interest in manly men. He did designs for Arrow shirts, and occasionally he would do these or Arrow collar shirts. Occasionally he would do these kind of tough guy, idealized man types for the Saturday Evening Post. And here we've got another Thanksgiving cover, this one from 1928, where we have a pilgrim staring down a football player, and they're both, they both have the bodies of like heroes, of gods here. And so he's basically saying that's who America's heroes and gods are, the founders, the pilgrims, these originators of the country, and then the guys that are playing sports over the holiday weekend. So he presents them as men to be worshipped on this cover. And in this case, I just want to offer up another Rockwell as contrast, because Rockwell never really goes in this direction in his body of work. He's always looking for a chance to add a little bit of humor and a little bit of fun. So when Rockwell paints football players, as he does throughout the years, he always keeps it lighthearted. So his football players from 1950 are these scrawny, gangly guys with giant feet, and it seems like neither one of them really want to win the coin toss at this particular football game. So this gives us a little bit of insight, a little bit of an introduction to Rockwell's mentor and idol at the Saturday Evening Post. I want to introduce you now to one of Rockwell's direct contemporaries, somebody else whose body of work had great influence on Norman Rockwell. And believe it or not, his name rhymes with Rockwell. His name is Douglas Rockwell. Now, it's interesting to me, at least, to know that a number of these men were contemporary in terms of age. A lot of times they were living near each other. Their families were roughly the same, they'd have kids the same age. They would spend their time socializing. They would work during the day and then have cocktails together at night. And that's certainly the case with Crockwell. He was also really interested in themes of family life, and he was also really interested in depicting children in his artwork. What we'll see is that he introduces themes that Rockwell kind of plays with and goes back to over the decades. So Crockwell ended up having another whole career beyond his time with the Saturday Evening Post. And in fact, he only ever created 18 covers for the magazine. I say only because so many of these other artists were doing hundreds, but he did have an outsized influence. So let's take a look at some of what Douglas Crockwell could produce for the Saturday Evening Post. All right, so over here on the left, we've got this charming young boy who is using that blank space, that pre-Ken Stewart format, right, with the prominent masthead that's kind of integrated into the design. And he's using all of that blank space to share the images, to share the doodles of this little child here. So it gives Rockwell the opportunity to kind of play like a child, to imagine, well, to make images, cute little stick figures that are interacting with the letters here. And then he also gives us the little boy who seems so proud of this work. And and so he engages us, the viewer, through that sweet child's face, and then through the playfulness of the imagery, of the childlike imagery beyond it. Now, over here on the right, we've got another prominent child's face. And in this case, it's a little boy getting his hair combed by an adult, maybe his mother, right? And because these hands are kind of disembodied, we become the parent in this moment. And we're the ones trying to make this little kid look like a little angel. But of course, the expression on his face shows the resistance. He's a little bit more of a demon than an angel in this case. So you kind of have to have a chuckle over that one too. These little kids acting like little kids. He's able to capture that so well in his covers. Another influential Rockwell cover here is from 1935, and it's called The Letter. In this case, we see siblings, a younger sister and an older brother, and they are fighting over this pink love letter with X's and hearts on it. I believe it's signed from Mary. So the breakdown here is that the little girl has found a love letter to her older brother, and she is running off with it. He is in close pursuit. And notice how pink his cheeks are. He's just absolutely so embarrassed by the fact that his little sister is reading this love letter here. So this is another theme that Rockwell takes up. And of course, it's like I mean, before email, of course, love letters proliferated. It was a great subject to focus on. Love letters are being mailed all over the country and around the world. So Rockwell gives us his own take on a love letter in the midst of World War II with this image called Double Trouble. And in this case, we have these two young women who are both working on their victory gardens. They've got their gardening tools on the ground here, and they've both gone over to their mailboxes simultaneously and found letters from the same young GI. And so there's the confrontation that's happening between these women based on those letters here. So a little bit of fighting over letters in both of these pictures. Now, this next image from Rockwell becomes a favorite subject for the cover of the Saturday Evening Post. It's measuring up. It's this idea of kids growing so fast. And as the mother of three young kids, I can tell you that this is really what we so often talk about with when we see kids, kids we know well, kids we don't know at all. We can always talk about how they're growing, right? And so in this case, a mother is asked her son to stand against his own father. And the father's hardly bothered to do this. He hasn't even put down his newspaper, but he's suddenly realizing that his son is taller than him. So dad is up on his tippy toes now, and he's looking a little anxious about this new change in status in the household. So this idea of measuring up, of getting bigger, of looking forward to next steps, like I said, becomes evergreen at the Saturday Evening Post. Here is a Norman Rockwell cover from 1947. So over a decade later, and Rockwell is thinking about a little boy who really wants to get bigger. And he has him measuring his own height on this wall against previous measurements and other children's measurements. We've got the dog here gazing upon this very earnest act. But Rockwell named this work, He's Going to Be Taller Than Dad. So that same formulation here is still in his head, and he's imagining, how can I present it in a new way where it's not back to back with dad? Instead, it's measuring yourself against the wall. Notice here that Rockwell is using almost that same tone from the sweater from the 1933 cover here too. In my mind, without a doubt, he was looking at Rockwell when he became inspired for this one. Now, one last Rockwell I wanted to share with you is this work here. This is 1941. And what we're looking at is a store gift exchange. We have this young woman who's working in retail. It's after the holidays, and we can see everybody is trying to return their stuff. She looks frustrated, maybe a little overwhelmed. Her eyes are kind of turned heavenward. And again, we have more disembodied hands, people who have their hands in her face trying to argue with her about the return of these items. Obviously, it's a really unpleasant job. It's a mountain of stuff behind her. This is pre-Ken Stewart, so we don't have all of the details of the space, just enough overwhelming and sort of visually conflicting elements of this stack of return presents that we get the sense of just how chaotic this work would be. And of course, the sign at the top that mentions the exchanges. Norman Rockwell takes up the same subject just 6 years later, or very similar subject. In this case, it's a shop girl on Christmas Eve. So instead of having to handle the returns, this is a young woman who was handling all of the wild last minute purchases. She's wearing a little clock on her chest here that indicates that it's just after 5 o'clock. So the store has closed. She's been run as ragged as the rag dolls that are falling off the shelf and all over the floor. Notice how she's sliding down the wall here, and she's kind of kicking off her shoes and stretching out those feet. You can like feel how sore her feet are in this moment. And you know all the work that's ahead of her in putting the store back together. I just noticed this right at this moment, that there is this crooked sign just over her head, very similar to the sign that we see over here in Crockwell's work. So Rockwell gets the chance to add more detail, add more information because of that format change in the cover. But I would say Crockwell's image, original image, is a really successful one, and I can see how the editors of the Saturday Evening Post would want to revisit it in some way. So let's turn our attention now fully to Norman Rockwell, an artist that almost needs no introduction, right? He's one of the most prolific artists for the Saturday Evening Post. He worked for a number of other publications too. He painted more than 320 covers for the Post over a 47-year career with the magazine. He really became synonymous with the magazine, and his images really had an outsized role in selling the publication and in helping to really define what America was. But as we'll see, Rockwell's work was always kind of in dialogue with his contemporaries. So Rockwell sold his first cover to the Saturday Evening Post in 1916. He was just 22 years old at the time. That was a $75 paycheck for him. He felt so successful that he then asked his first wife to marry him and sort of launched his life from this image. We can see early on that he's aiming for humor, and this was considered a very successful publication or a successful illustration. So what we're looking at, of course, is a young boy who's pushing a baby buggy here. There's an infant inside. He's all dressed up and he's got the baby bottle in his breast pocket there. There are other boys the same age who are dressed in baseball uniforms, and they are heading off to play and act like kids. So they are sort of teasing this little boy who has to grow up a little too soon and take care of what is presumably a younger sibling. So Rockwell has some early success, and it helps to launch this very long and successful career. And it gives us images like this one. He's so well known for his depictions of children on the cover of the Post, and this one, Little Girl with a Black Eye, I think is particularly successful. This was a 1953 cover. So let's talk about what he does in this picture that makes this image so enduring, so appealing, so enduring, in fact, that this is an image that was quoted in the movie Forrest Gump when they're covering Forrest Gump's early life. He sits outside of his principal's office in a very similar way in a scene that's framed up to look just like this. So we see a little girl who is confronting us directly. We're in dialogue with her. We feel an immediate connection to her because she's looking right at us and she's smiling. She's smiling, of course, because she was just in a fight And it seems as though she's happy with its outcome, even though there's a black eye as a result. Her hair's been kind of messed up. Her shirt is untucked. She's got a band-aid on her knee, and she's got these big socks that are kind of sliding down. She's a scrappy little kid, and you can tell from the background that the teacher, or maybe that's her parent, and the principal have no idea what to do with this kid. She doesn't quite follow the rules, right? But there's such a wonderful kind of intimate setup here with this child, pushing the adults into the background, and then just the wonderful details of the school itself, the linoleum floors, the open file over here, some of the children's artwork up on the wall. There's a lot to kind of delve into, and a lot that felt familiar, and I think to a certain degree still really does. Although I'm not sure anybody could really get away with the same subject. We think about bullying in very different ways today, don't we? So Rockwell focused on children, but he also focused on family. And this might be one of his most sentimental, although it's a complicated scene. This is his picture called The Marriage License from 1954. And I love how this whole picture just kind of glows. It reminds me of like a Rembrandt painting from the 1600s. It's rather dark overall, but we see this girl in this yellow dress here, and she looks like she's illuminated from within. She is this lovely young lady who is signing her marriage license alongside her idealized husband here. They're just a beautiful couple. And waiting for them to finish up in this kind of rundown bureaucratic office is the town clerk who is overseeing this process. Now, Norman Rockwell usually includes a dog to signify love and fidelity. You'd think he would do that for a work about marriage. In this case, he adds in a little cat. What's he trying to suggest about that? We think of cats as being kind of aloof. Perhaps this older gentleman here is sort of thinking about the nature of marriage itself. We've got a blossoming flower that might indicate love in its earliest stages, but then just below it, this kind of disgusting spittoon with all this detritus around it. So maybe Rockwell's giving us a little bit of the good and the bad that will follow for this beautiful young couple right on the precipice of starting the next chapter of their lives. So beyond children and family, we also get patriotic images. Rockwell did this so well. This is his 1943 Rosie the Riveter. She's still a crowd pleaser. I think she's just incredible. This painting recently sold for about $4.9 million. And I think people love it because Rosie here is the embodiment of women going out into the workforce and supporting the war effort during World War II. We've got this tough woman with these gigantic arms sitting very proudly and confidently with her rivet gun on her lap, and her lunch pail there as well. She's holding her sandwich up, kind of looking down her nose as she's stomping out Adolf Hitler's autobiography, Mein Kampf, My Struggle, down there at the bottom. Norman Rockwell makes her a saint, even adds a little halo there for Rosie and the work that she is doing. So then, of course, as we round out our look at Norman Rockwell, he becomes the story. His fame, the adoration around him, becomes a cover story for the Saturday Evening Post in 1960. He's called America's Best Loved Artist. And this is, of course, his famous triple self-portrait. We'll just zoom in on that picture for just a moment. I'm sure some of you have seen that at the Norman Rockwell Museum in Stockbridge, Massachusetts. It's a favorite for so many because it is Norman Rockwell using his typical self-deprecating charm. Here he's showing himself in the process of creating a self-portrait. Of course, he's shown himself more than once here. We see him from behind in a reflection on the canvas that he's painting, and then even some studies that are tacked up on that canvas. But the joke here is that his own reflection shows a man who can't really see. We don't see his eyes beyond the lenses of his glasses. And he's got this kind of droopy pipe hanging from his mouth. He looks almost cartoonishly like a pencil neck geek in some way, right? And then the picture that he is creating in response to that reflection is a man without glasses on who's got his pipe at a jaunty angle. Rockwell's doing a little bit of showing off because he has pinned up on his canvas and has painted very precisely famous self-portraits throughout the history of art. We've got Albert Dürer and Rembrandt and something like a Picasso and Vincent van Gogh here. The joke is that he's not painting his self-portrait really to look anything like this, but that he not only is he aware of this history, that he can replicate it so effectively. So he shows this whole precarious endeavor kind of unfolding with like a glass of soda that looks like it's going to fall off of his book, a little bit of a fire that's starting in his garbage pail after he's lit his pipe. But the detail that I love most about this painting, and you can see it so well when you're standing in front of it in Stockbridge, Massachusetts, is that the back of his belt and even his wallet have all of these little paint fingerprints on it. So you can imagine he's sort of hiking up his pants in the midst of painting, and he gets a little paint unintentionally on his backside that way. It's a great work. Oh my goodness. So we're going to switch gears now. And with our limited time, I'm going to fly us through a few other illustrators from the Saturday Evening Post and talk a little bit about their relationships here too. Um, George Hughes actually moved to Arlington, Vermont, where Rockwell lived for a number of years while he was working for the Saturday Evening Post. So there's like this group of post illustrators living in small town America. And like I said, they get together and talk shop and also just talk about family life and what that looked like. So there's a lot of cross-pollination with Rockwell's work here. But George Hughes, one of the big distinctions is that he had worked for Vanity Fair and for House and Garden. He was very interested in fashion and really women's sensibilities too. We see that play out in a cover like this one from 1961 called Hitting the Buffet. And I just love this detail. We've got all these ladies in these lovely clothes at a party, and then the little guy, this little boy in his bathrobe, figuring this is his chance to fill his belly. So he's up there with the adults. But I think you see a little bit of that interest in fashion with a cover like this. Hughes gives us these iconic covers. This is a 1948 cover. I believe this was his first work for the Saturday Evening Post, and people went crazy over this. In fact, somebody wrote to the Saturday Evening Post and said that cover could have been torn off the magazine and dropped in any place on the face of the globe, and anyone who picked it up would have said, "That's America." And all we see here, of course, is a mom who's doing her laundry and a dirty little boy who's coming home after playing after school. He's got his baseball glove and bat here, and he doesn't have a care in the world. So we see a little bit about modern life dynamics here to a certain extent, and we see that even the audience, the readers, recognize that this is reflecting their culture. I couldn't leave this image out here. And this one is from 1948 as well, and it's called Future President. It's down, taking place obviously down in DC outside of the White House, and a father who is crouched over to snap this picture of his little boy looking like Napoleon out in front of the White House. I just love how, well, I don't love, but I noticed that they're sort of ignoring their daughter in this moment. And she seems to be kind of looking over her shoulder, almost saying, like, just you wait, I'll have my moment too. Um, we see a couple of several covers from Hughes that focus on these kind of rites of passage. They oftentimes feature a statuesque and well-dressed mom kind of going through the awkward moments of rearing children, whether it's dropping a child off at kindergarten who does not want to be dropped off, or getting a little boy ready for his first real date here. Notice the look of surprise as she's helping him with this bow tie over here. But again, these details here, especially of the bedroom, I think are details that Americans would have just really responded to. In fact, these red chairs with the cane seating, tend to be featured on a lot of these covers. So I think this was the kind of space that was so familiar to the readers. George Hughes loved to delve into women's relationships. So here, the tire's flat, the husband's outside trying to fix it, but the women are sort of yucking it up inside. They're not deterred from having a good time. Over here, we've got a picture about gossip. This is called The Gossiping Neighbor from 1951. And we can see this lovely woman in pink has been pulled away from her card game. Maybe they're playing bridge by a neighbor who's come to deliver some news. And it certainly seems to be news about this blonde woman. And even the other card players seem really intrigued as to what's going on. Gossip becomes a good topic for the cover of the Saturday Evening Post. Rockwell did his own version about how news can spread through a community. News about him, in fact, this is his 1948 cover, where the gossip originates with this older woman and goes through all of these people who listen to it and then share it with someone else. There's laughter, there's shock, there's disbelief, a lot of giggling. And then eventually the gossip gets all the way back to Norman Rockwell himself, the subject of the gossip, and then he gets to confront the older woman who starts the rumor. So it's interesting to see how these two artists in particular have the same kind of assignment and they approach it in such different ways. But Hughes and Rockwell oftentimes took the same subject and played it in very similar ways. Hughes was oftentimes portraying covers that were not just about the visuals, but also about hearing, that sort of appealing to another sense and asking us as viewers I think, get fully involved with these images. So over on the left, we have the children who snuck down the stairs to listen in on what the parents are talking about. And then over on the right, a woman who is cleaning a theater setting here who has stopped to listen in to the orchestra practicing. Now, Rockwell did a picture years after Hughes's picture here of a little girl who's looking down the stairs to a Christmas party. And notice how all of in both of these images, the kids all have these white pajamas on that are tinged a little bit gray here. It's a cold color. It kind of isolates them from the warm yellow and golden tones where the adults are, where the adult things happening are. So it's a great way to isolate these kids visually and to sort of set a particular mood. I think Rockwell's picture is incredibly successful. I think it's such a striking image. Rockwell also did a painting, a cover about cleaning women in a theater who pause, in this case, to read the playbill, not to listen in on a rehearsal. This work predates George Hughes's picture, but you can sort of see how images like this are in dialogue with each other and how they might have inspired each other over the years as well. Now, George Hughes also takes up the subject of little kids measuring up, little kids wanting to be bigger and grown. Here on the right, we see a little girl striking the same pose as this elegant mannequin in a beautiful red dress. On the right, we have a little boy who's been looking at a bodybuilding magazine. He stands in front of the mirror on his closet door, trying to strike the same pose. We see his face in profile as he's looking down at that tiny little bicep. Rockwell gives us a similar picture. He did it first, believe it or not. This was his picture called The Muscle Man from almost 10 years earlier. It's almost the exact same setup. It's the closet door with the mirror, there's the wallpaper, there's even the dog. And sometimes you just see that Rockwell does it better. This is my unbiased opinion, right? But in this case, we see the little boy. We see the earnestness and the desire in his face, and even the dog's face too. So there's something I think that makes Rockwell's picture easier for us to connect with in this case. Now, another George Hughes picture that really inspired Norman Rockwell is this one here called Sunday Visitors. And I think this is our last Hughes picture, and then we'll touch on last two artists very quickly. Sunday Visitors gives us a husband who is stretched out on this red couch in the sea of newspapers, not expecting any company, but here they are. And the wife has opened the door and sort of thrown open her arms either to greet them or to try and hold them back because he certainly doesn't look like he wants company. And I think that this was great inspiration to Rockwell, and a similar picture where a father is also in red and sort of trying to get out of familial obligations, but he's also in a sea of newspapers as his family's dutifully marching off to Sunday Easter services. So our next artist here is John Falter, and his work is really just a little bit different from these other artists. He was a Midwestern artist, sort of a slightly different sensibility. There is a John Philip Falter Museum in Falls City, Nebraska, but he was also prolific for the Saturday Evening Post. He did more than 200 covers. His work is oftentimes confused with Rockwell, but you can see right off the bat, it's different. This is a back to school picture from 1945. We see the young figure from behind walking across this field to what is presumably the schoolhouse in the distance. And he is looking longingly at the freedom of the butterfly that is floating alongside him. This picture, it's not a sunny day. It's not kids playing. It's not the sense of optimism about going back to school. Instead, this picture reminded me so much of Andrew Wyeth and Christina's world here with this big wheat field and even the tire tracks here too. Perhaps it inspired Andrew Wyeth because this picture came just a couple of years later. Now, John Falter gives us these family scenes, these scenes of what it's like to raise a kid in the modern era, but he also gives us scenes of stress. This little boy who's flooding his bathroom and screaming, but he's locked himself in, and the parents that are desperately trying to come through the door here. There's a lot of tension in a picture like that. We have, in this case, the dad who's come home, and all the kids have come together and they're making music that we can only imagine is absolutely horrible on the ears, right? Blaring horns. Rockwell gives us similar pictures over the years, but he doesn't have a father who's cringing in the background. Instead, he just suggests the garishness of the noise by a hiding puppy and a really loud pattern on the chair. Falter, John Philip Falter, also gives us scenes of, I think, sort of unexpected isolation. We've got a diner scene here, and this one dates to 1940. And I think people might be surprised to see that something, or 1946, people might be surprised to see that this is on the cover of the Saturday Evening Post because it's not quintessential small town where everybody's interacting with each other. Instead, there's a sense of isolation. It's almost as though they're all on their phones as they would be today. Rockwell uses the same setup, the same perspective to give us these heartwarming moments of kids after the prom, showing off their corsages, showing off their dates, really, with all of this pride, real sort of slice of life from small town America, or this iconic image from 1958 of the runaway, the little boy who has been found by a Massachusetts state trooper, and they're sitting at the same diner we see, or similar diner. We see them from behind as we do in the Falter picture, but in this case, it is a moment of connection. It's the exchange glances and that incredible sense of safety and security for this young boy. You know he's going to be just fine. Now, one last Falter image that I think gets quoted quite a bit. It's all about neighbors, right? This is a picture that is called Tidy and Sloppy Neighbors. We have one very fastidious neighbor on this side who's trimming his hedges. His lawn is perfect, beautiful garden, well-maintained house. But he's right there up against another house that is messy and overgrown, and we can see sort of a lazy neighbor asleep under the newspaper on the steps. This picture was recently quoted for the cover of a New Yorker magazine. This was just a couple of years ago, I think in the midst of the pandemic, maybe, where we can see sort of the political divide playing out with the differences of these townhouses and the signs that they have in their yard. I think this New Yorker cover artist, though, gives us a little bit of hope because they both have the patriotic flag out front too. So there's that commonality there. So we're just flying so fast here, but I've got one last artist to share with you, and I promise you that you'll love him. His name is Richard Sargent. This is the only image I could find of him. He also went by the name Dick Sargent, and if that name sounds familiar to you, there was the famous actor. Apparently, he took that as a stage name because he so loved Richard Sargent's illustrations. So Richard Sargent, like so many of these other illustrators that we've seen today, was a young dad, and his redheaded son oftentimes was featured on the cover of the Saturday Evening Post. He did 47 covers in total, and he does a lot of scenes, as we'll see, that are almost broken down like comic book panels. Interesting storytelling that I think still resonates. But you can see here his little redhead is practicing the violin, and he's put earmuffs on because it sounds so bad even to him. I love the look of shock here as he's listening to this older woman sing in church. So you almost get, again, sort of like an audio experience as you're looking at these images. He gives us little boys that seem to be doing nice things, cleaning up their room or giving a seat on the train to Santa, but always with ulterior motives, or maybe something else behind the scenes happening. He's just cleaned his room, but really just shoved everything under the bed. And of course, in this case, he just wants to get in good with Santa. Rockwell also did a Santa on the train from just a little bit earlier. In this case, the boy sort of recognizing that Santa without the beard is, in fact, the same Santa that he just saw at the department store. Both Dick Sargent and Rockwell also took up the subject of finding Santa costuming at home. And Sargent did it first. This is a 1951 cover where there's this sweet little boy up in the attic, and he's going through this chest where he finds the beard and the other elements of the costume, and he's looking sort of shocked as he's taking all of this out. Rockwell, I think, one-ups him just a little bit from just a few years later with a painting that's called The Discovery from 1956. In this case, it's a boy who's not in the attic, but perhaps more believably, just going through his parents' drawers, his father's drawer in this case. He's opened a package almost as though it's Christmas morning, and he has found this Santa costume complete with the beard attached to the hat. And he's holding that beard in the same way that kids oftentimes pull it down at the department store. He's looking right out at us, pulling us into the picture. And Rockwell even included some of these mothballs, almost like the suggestion of falling snow on Christmas morning. Rockwell, I know, got some blowback on this particular image because it forced a lot of uncomfortable conversations between parents and kids. Now, Dick Sargent also gave us some images about growing up, wanting to be a little bit bigger. This is sort of similar to the muscle man that we saw before. And I give him some credit because by 1960, how do you do this in a new way? I love that he has thought, that this little boy has thought of putting the light bulb behind him and getting a nice big shadow out of it. But here are just a couple of examples of Sargent's kind of split screen covers, and these are evergreen. I mean, I still see people sharing these covers on social media. And of course, this one is about how we discipline children. In 1890, you might hit them. In 1910, you might scold them, and by 1952, you're sitting and having a conversation with them. And sort of depending on your particular opinions about rearing children, you might find this to be horrible or wonderful. It sort of plays both ways, right? I have a feeling that Sargent's intention here was to make fun of the current trends. Sargent also gives us what I think is a rather profound image about how bad feelings can kind of roll downhill. In this case, the dad getting yelled at work. He goes home, yells at his wife. The wife yells at the child, and then the child even yells at the pet. So we can see this influence that impacts everybody in the family. We can also see from an image like this, sort of the pitfalls of parenting sometimes. A father that sees his son enjoying a toy train goes out and buys him the best one he can find. And then in the end, the child is still just playing with the toy train that had initially made them happy. I've experienced something like this myself. And then we also see a little slice of life at the office too. The big man coming in, his secretary has nothing to do. He's got a pile of papers on his desk, but he's also got his golf clubs. So then in the end, the secretary's overworked and he is practicing his putt with nothing, no other obligations in his office. And it looks as though it was not a lot of time in between delegating and playing golf. So one last image from Dick Sargent, and you can see that he really has his finger on the pulse of American life in the 1950s with this kind of storytelling that still feels relevant today. In this case, he's divided his canvas into three, and it's a family in a nice big car going off for a picnic. There's all this joy and expectation. They're playing outside, but we can see that mom's doing a lot of the heavy lifting. She's cleaning up after everybody. And then poor mom has to drive home while everybody sleeps. So we've got at least a little bit of sympathy for the modern American woman here. So we will wrap up very quickly today. Oh, and then just a nice comparison with our Norman Rockwell with a very similar subject called Going and Coming, a family that's off to the lake and then coming home later, and at least mom gets to sleep in this one here. So we'll wrap up very quickly with just our big idea for today. We're back to the blank canvas and then an image from 1961, also from Norman Rockwell, that gives us kind of the full evolution of the Saturday Evening Post covers back from the earliest days of the Pennsylvania Gazette all the way up through J.C. Leyendecker and the Babies and others. And I think what I'd love for people to take away from today's program is that these illustrators of the Saturday Evening Post really help to identify the quintessential American experience. They represented that American experience with humor and with charm, and they essentially created this mirror through which Americans could see themselves and laugh at themselves. These illustrators lived and worked closely together. They're always collaborating and inspiring each other, refining each other's ideas, and in the process, defining what it meant to be American. So I will end there for now, right at 8 o'clock. And I welcome any questions or comments you have about the artists that we saw today. Thank you very much. I'll start going through the chat here. Let's see. Oh, this is interesting. Nancy noticed that Crockwell signed his paintings with his first name, Douglas, maybe as a way to separate himself out from Rockwell. And Nancy also asked, is that lady on Christmas Eve wearing curlers? I think that was the shop girl maybe that we were talking about with Rockwell. And my hunch is that she is not Christmas Eve over here. She just has very curly, tightly curled hair. The story behind this is that Rockwell actually couldn't find a shop girl at Marshall Fields in Chicago that would serve as that like fit in his mind's eye or aligned with what he had envisioned in his mind's eye. So then he went out to lunch and he saw a woman working at a diner and he thought, that is my perfect exhausted shop girl. So he had the waitress from the diner pose for him. And I've seen photographs of the model, and she did not have curlers in her hair, but she does have a pencil stuck through there. Jan says, very interesting to read the titles of the featured articles. Doesn't it make you want to go back and read all of these articles too? Mark says, ironic, but I checked and Rockwell died of emphysema. So apparently his iconic pipe killed him. Ooh, that could be the case. He had a nice long life though, so it didn't take him too soon. But yeah, I mean, smoking is it's never going to extend your life, right? Polly says these illustrations didn't seem connected to the current events reported in the magazines. What time frame did they have to do these paintings, and were they all paintings? These are great questions, Polly. Okay, So oftentimes these paintings were executed within the space of a month. And it seems as though it was sort of the intention of the editors of the Saturday Evening Post that the covers didn't necessarily have to do with current events. It was more like universal experiences that I think they were going for. So it is interesting to think like of the delay as it related to the execution of the images. And for Rockwell, at least, these were finished oil paintings, completed oil paintings. So it would take a while to do this. And perhaps that was why by the 1960s and news happening even quicker and quicker, that these kinds of images in part went out of fashion. Great question. Gets us thinking about the time and the production here. Lois, thanks for your kind words. And Susan, I would agree with you. It is a pretty sanitized version of America. It's also a reflection of the men who were these artists who were creating these images. I mean, they were essentially painting their lives, and they lived in, middle class white America. So that's what we were getting. Although it is worth stating that the Saturday Evening Post had a policy that said you couldn't show people of color on the cover, specifically Black people, unless they were in subservient positions. So there were some editorial policies there that kind of constricted what these artists could do. I have other programs that focus on Rockwell's kind of pushback with that policy. Much to my pleasure here, and great surprise that he was not in favor of that. And so there's more information around that if you were ever so interested. And thank you everybody for the very kind words. I'm just kind of going through them quickly to make sure that I can see it. The questions, Lisa says, was the painting submitted to the magazine as a full-size painting? Yes, so the painting would be submitted and then photographed, and then oftentimes the artists would give the paintings to their models. That's what Norman Rockwell would do. So it's not like they were going into museums. They were considered commercial art. Sharon says, as Robert would say, let's give a big virtual round of applause. Thank you, Sharon. And thank you everybody for these very kind words. Audra, thank you. Claudia says, was an African-American or Asian on the cover of the Post? And that speaks to that policy that I just mentioned. You probably asked your question before I mentioned it, but there was a policy basically saying that people of color weren't supposed to be on the cover unless they were in subservient positions. It is, I think, really important for all of us to reflect upon what that meant for the way people thought of what it meant to be American. That had outsized influence and control in a very negative and damaging way, I would say. Shirley, Kathleen says, why was there a helmet on top of his triple self-portrait? That is a great question. It's something that I always go back to as well. It sort of looks like an important historical object, doesn't it? It sort of, once again, kind of roots him back to this important history that he's kind of relying on when he's creating this image, almost in the same way that this golden eagle on top of the frame sort of makes it American. But it was, if I'm remembering correctly, haven't looked this up recently, but if I'm remembering correctly, it was just kind of like one step up from a piece of junk that he came across. I think he might have found it even at like a yard sale. But if anybody looks that up really quickly and is able to correct me, please do by all means. Lita, thank you for asking for my website or email. Everybody can get in touch with me on my website, which is I am culturally curious. I'll type that into the chat too. I am culturallycurious.com. And I have a calendar page on my website where you can register for free upcoming Zooms like this one. Next month's featured program is about artists inspired by Maine. That debuts, I think, in a week. So we'll see how that one comes out. And thank you, everybody, again, for these very kind words. I'm looking at all of these comments, and they do mean a great deal to me. I think we got to, thank you, Frank, for your kind words. I agree with you. It's silly to categorize some of them as illustrators and other artists as painters. The distinction is just they were creating these images for commercial purposes, really. I don't think it's a distinction that we fuss over too much today. Uh, Elizabeth raised her hand. Paula raised her hand. I'm not sure I am able to unmute you, but if you'd like to write a question in the Q&A, I'll look over there. Dorothy asks, were they assigned a subject or were they free to choose their own? Great question, Dorothy. I think a lot of these things played out collaboratively. And certainly there were edits that were happening from the art editor. In some cases, he would even paint things out. And I know that ruffled a few feathers, but Ken Stewart in particular came from an illustration background, so he worked very well with these editors. But the editors were, I think, initially giving a lot of insight into what would grab people's attention. And then these artists that had these very long careers with the magazine got more and more freedom along the way. Deborah asks, any books you might recommend on this subject? Actually, what I would recommend, Deborah, is going to the Saturday Evening Post website, because they have a whole archive of all of these images. It is a repository of great information. You can read about all of these artists. It is worth, I think it's about $15 or $20 to buy a subscription online, but you have unlimited access to all of this. That's where I might start. And somebody asked, did they all work together at the same time over several years? J.C. Leyendecker was earlier on, and then most of these other artists from Hughes to Crockwell to Sargent were all working roughly at the same time post-war. Diane also asked for a recommendation on Saturday Evening Post covers. Again, I would start with their website. And let's see here. Somebody else asked, the artist in the final Rockwell image, African American, had the policy changed in 1961. Rockwell, it's really interesting, was always pushing against that policy. And I'm trying to think of which image you're looking at that might have had an African American in it. Maybe it was the last picture. I'm not sure. It was a policy that he was always pushing against. And so he left the publication, if I'm remembering correctly, in the early years of the 1960s. It was either 61 or 63. But by that point, he had this kind of outsized power too. He was America's most beloved artist. So he would find ways to literally integrate his scenes and sometimes get it past the editors of the Saturday Evening Post. But I think it was still a fight. Jan says maybe the black girl in the shadow on the wall picture. Sorry, I'm just a little thrown. I'm not sure if I know which one we're talking about. But I will say, if you're thinking of the image of Ruby Bridges, that was later on, that was not for the Saturday Evening Post. That was for Look magazine, and it was also on the inside. I think I have to do like a standalone video about that picture, particularly because it's brought up so much now that Kamala Harris is the presumptive nominee running for president. And I think oftentimes that image of Ruby Bridges is sort of uh, linked to her running now. Mary says, did Rockwell submit illustrations that were rejected, never used on covers? Yes, he did. Yes, he did, Mary. That's such an interesting question. There is an image that I'm always really interested in. It's also an image that involves a black eye. It's an image actually of domestic abuse. It's a couple that's sitting outside of a marriage counselor's door in the waiting room of a marriage for a marriage counselor. And the subject, I think, was just considered unappealing once it was done. But it's a fascinating image. And I'm particularly fascinated because there are all these books that are included in the work, including like Van Eyck art books, basically, that are related to images of famous couples. So it's an interesting choice on his part. Thomas says Rockwell evolved significantly from sanitized versions of Middle America to stark reliefs of racial unrest and left the Saturday Evening Post partly due to this. Thank you, Thomas. Very well said. I appreciate that. Sharon asks, the little boy in line at the buffet. Yes, and Jan is talking about that meme now that I was just referencing to with Ruby Bridges in the shadow, and and I think Sharon is maybe still thinking about images that might have an African American figure in it. Maybe it's this one that you were thinking of, Sharon. I don't know off the top of my head. And off the top of my head, as I'm thinking about these images, I can't think of any of them that have African Americans in them. So again, it's a disappointing fact that there was this policy that really changed and dictated how we thought what America was, because of the power of this particular form of media at this particular period in history. Now we're all getting information from all these different sources all the time, and it's also varied. And back in the 1950s, it looked a certain way, didn't it? So it's an unfortunate fact, and I very much appreciate all the people that have called that out tonight, because it should be acknowledged. So I appreciate all of you. I think I got to all of the questions, and I so appreciate all the kind comments. Again, if anybody wants to reach out to me, you can go to iamculturallycurious.com. And I look forward to sharing another program with you next month on Artists Inspired by Maine, Down East Connections. That will be a lot of fun. And if you need to hear from me in the meantime, you can always look at my calendar on my website. Thank you so much, everybody. And I so appreciate your time and attention. Have a great rest of the night. Take care, everyone.